And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. Joining me, as always, is contributor Shayne Kubas. We are going to talk Steelers in respect to the NFL draft today. We're going to break down all of their pre-draft visits, all their stops along the way, and we're even going to predict the 20th overall pick at the end of this show today. We're going to answer some of the biggest draft questions the Steelers fans have had along the way, so stay with us for that. Shayne, let's open up with a little bit of news this morning. Nothing huge pertaining to the Steelers, but I do want to talk about the Stephon Diggs trade that just went down. Diggs is being sent to the Houston Texans for a second-round pick. Big move in the NFL. Big implications for both sides here. I think it means the Bills are drafting a receiver, obviously, very early in the draft. And then Texans get another toy for C.J. Stroud to play with.
Yeah, I think that they saw partially what the Titans are trying to do with surrounding talent around their young quarterback, and we saw how well Stroud played as a rookie. They're doing this the right way, right? They hit on quarterbacks, so now the window is open. How much can you get done in the next 3 or so calendar years, right? How much talent can you acquire? How effectively can you use your cap space? What kind of decisions do you need to make around him? Like, that's what this is all about now. And something that I'll be honest, I'm a little bit jealous of, I'll be honest with you. It's a situation where it's like, man, it'd be nice to have a CJ Stroud right now. But yeah, I mean, for both sides, I think the Bills, clearly there's been some tension there, whether they, how much of it was real or not, we don't know, but clearly they wanted him out of the building to some degree. Maybe it was truly just for like the team building aspect, but they took a hefty dead cap hit to make this move now. When they did. So clearly they wanted him off the team. They wanted some draft capital, got a decent return overall, second round pick next year, in a class that maybe not quite as stacked at the top as this one probably will be, but still a valuable pick. Like I said, the Texans, you get a player that, he's not the same Stephon Diggs he was a few years ago. I think he has lost a little bit of that explosiveness that made him so talented and so impactful, but for being your second receiver, probably with Nico Collins breaking out last year and Tank Dell coming back, you hope healthy, like that is a trio that can win you a lot of games just with your offense, let alone the defense that's also coming along.
Yeah, and to a lesser degree, or a greater degree, I should say, compared to the Steelers, it kind of feels like the Deontay Johnson thing where they just wanted him out at this point. You talked about the dead money that they're taking with this deal. I think it's better for the Texans than it is for the Bills because overall, the Bills have to pay that guaranteed money. The Texans were a playoff team last year, and I think that it gives them another weapon to play with. It is a trade that could potentially work out for both sides. I'll be interested to see who Buffalo now drafts with that capital early on, but I would think like first round they're going receiver. I kind of like to see like Ladd McConkey there filling that void in that role. I think that he would be an interesting fit. Let's talk about a visit the Steelers just had with a veteran linebacker, Khalil Hudson. The Steelers aren't done addressing the linebacker position yet. Shayne, they signed Patrick Queen, gave him a big deal this offseason, 3 years, $41 million. I wondered if they were going to look at this in the NFL draft, but if they are content with signing another veteran, I don't know if they will draft a linebacker at all. And so that's kind of the route I'm preferring that they would go. Hudson was a 4-year player at Washington, played for the Commanders the past 4 years, was a former 5th-round pick. Interestingly, he was Devin Bush's teammate at Michigan. Some of the same size and athletic traits, 5'11", 220-ish pounds. Very short arms, though, 29 and like an 1/8-inch arm. So his arms are 1 percentile length. Kind of has that like Mark Robinson type build to him a little bit there. A lot of special teams usage under his belt, though, over 1,200 special team snaps in his first 4 seasons. What do you make of this visit?
I actually like this a lot because down the stretch, he got to play finally on defense after years of kind of just being a special teamer and honestly played very well, like especially as a coverage player. I think he has a lot of instincts and a lot of speed. We talked about the athleticism aspect. Yeah, he's definitely a small player for sure, even for modern linebackers, definitely on the smaller side. But I think in that role, if you need someone to cover somebody, I think that's something he's going to be able to do. And we clearly need help just a linebacker across the board with the injury potential and everything else. So getting a guy that has all the special teams value, so he has value for you there, but also when he has gotten on the field, has shown the ability to have those coverage chops. That's kind of what I'm looking for if I'm looking for another linebacker for the Steelers right now.
Yeah, and they need depth. Obviously, they don't want to get into a situation like they were in last year where you're picking up guys off the street and being forced to play them. It's worth noting that Hudson started 8 games last year,
Right, exactly.
played nearly 500 snaps on offense, combined with a bunch of snaps on special teams. So an interesting depth piece if they are to sign him. We'll keep our eyes out for that. And the Steelers added 4 more pre-draft visits to their list. 2 of these are counted as top 30 visits. The other 2 are local visits from Pitt. Matt Gongalvis and MJ Devonshire. So those are more of mid-round guys. Mason Smith is the one that's interesting to me here, Shayne, because that it feels like Steelers are trying to get back to their roots a little bit on the defensive line with these big, long players like this. Now, Smith, he has less than 1,000 college snaps in his career, just plagued with injuries, but he's a very intriguing prospect.
Yeah, I will say with him, like I recently did for some other stuff I do for scouting and other things. I did my defensive line rankings, and he did not make my top 10 interior defensive lineman. He's a guy that I think is talented, but you talked about the injuries, you talk about the lack of snaps. I also just think that for his size, he doesn't play with the strength that I'd want him to play with. I think the length is clearly there, but I don't know if he's really a good pass rusher or a good run defender right now. And I'm not really sure which way, if he is going to grow into a good role into either one, it kind of could go either way for me. Like he's one of those players that the size looks intriguing, but I don't know if he plays up to that size typically. And generally that's not going to be somebody that I'm interested in. But if you can get him later in the draft, like he's probably, at best a 3rd round pick, probably more likely, early day 3, not necessarily something I'm completely out on, but interesting. Like you said, that they're looking at that type of player, because I do think they need to go in that direction at least. So.
Yeah, he's such a polarizing prospect because he's really all over the map. Like Pro Football Focus has him 148th on their board right now. In the NFL mock draft consensus board, they have him 79th overall.
Huge difference.
He's just the gap, the discrepancy where he is right now is enormous. And so I'll be interested to see where he ultimately goes. One thing is worth noting, Shayne, is you just don't get many guys with his frame coming out on the interior defensive line anymore. I mean, there's a couple of these guys every draft. It seems like sometimes it seems like you can go a few years without having someone with his frame. He's got 95th percentile arm length and wingspan and just ability to grow into that frame even more. And so I think it is an intriguing type of player, has a lot of developing still to do. And again, the usage was very minimal in college because of the injuries. I do think you probably have to get this guy with one of your 3rd round picks if you're Pittsburgh. I just think that he will go off the shelf at some point because somebody's going to value that size and length that he has there. So just my 2 cents on him. Any chats you want to get to before we move on?
Yeah, we can jump into a couple here. We have, I know one related to the Diggs conversation a little bit because of the Texans. They kind of are flush with receivers right now to a certain degree, at least like depth receivers. I haven't heard this yet. I haven't looked at this, but our good friend, our Barley18 loves to chime in here. Steelers have reached out to Houston about Woods or Mechie, I'm hearing. Now, Mechie I'd be interested in because he would be that slot type that we don't really have on the roster right now. That I think could, in Arthur Smith's offense, maybe isn't the most valuable role, but we at least need somebody to do that. So I think he'd be an interesting kind of buy low candidate after he hasn't really, developed into anything for them yet. Woods, he's a veteran that I don't know is any better than like the Jeffersons of the world, like Van Jefferson's. Like he's kind of gotten to that point. Love him throughout his career, but I don't know if he's really an impact at this point. But we'll see if they still could easily add receivers, whether it's on the trade market or more likely in the draft. But I still think they're going to be talking about that. And then a couple things about the draft needs, I think here. Hey guys, am I nuts? Well, great start there. We'll say, but I'm less concerned about corner early as most. I believe one, if not both, Trice or Rush will develop. I'm okay with taking a slot corner around 3 or 4. I believe center and tackle priority. Now, I will say center and tackle are a little higher on my priority list as far as their draft needs, but I am concerned at corner because I do think that realistically, Dante Jackson is not a number 2 corner in the NFL anymore. That's just my opinion of him at this point. I'd much rather him be like the 3rd outside corner, or if he could play slot, that'd be awesome, but I just don't think he's going to do that. So it is a bigger need for me. And also Trice and Rush, like, yes, they're both very talented. Trice is more of an injury question than a talent question. And then, Rush, obviously we got him for essentially nothing for a reason. The Colts didn't have him make the roster. But yeah, you hope that's the case. Like, you hope they can at least develop into depth players. And I think that's likely. But it's still something I'm not going to be surprised if they address pretty early in the draft. And we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, they need help there. They really do.
Yeah.
And I was as big of a Corey Trice fan as anybody. I had a 2-3
Yes.
grade on him. But it's the injuries is why
Yeah.
he fell. And you could
Yeah.
see that in training camp when he blew an ACL right at the beginning of the summer. And so I think that it's hard to count on either of those guys, considering that Trice was almost went undrafted. I mean, several picks away from being an
for a
undrafted
reason.
player,
Yeah,
essentially. And
unfortunately.
then Darius Rush was on three. This is his third NFL team, and the Steelers played him at safety last year. So
Yeah.
I don't know how much confidence we should have in them at this point that they will be that guy opposite of Joey Porter. I think that they are going to need to address the position. I don't think that they get a long-term starter or anything in the draft, because I think that they're going to prioritize other needs here.
Right.
If you do, it'll be at slot corner. I think that's where
Yeah.
the Steelers are looking. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit here, but good questions there. And then you talked about the Robert Woods, John Mechie thing. Like, Woods is like a clone of Van Jefferson at this point in his career. I think that's a little bit of redundancy there. I don't see that one happening. If it does, I would have a hard time making sense of it. Mechie more so because of the slot ability. And I guess, I mean, the Texans could be willing to ship one of their receivers now. They just traded for Diggs, but I would prefer them to go the draft route, though. I don't want to have to give up anything more than like a late round pick swap for any receiver of that caliber. All right, let's move on to our first big discussion topic for the day, Shayne. And that is the Steelers pre-draft visit tracker. I want to break down all these stops along the way here. And then we actually have a graphic that we're gonna throw up here as well, Shayne. So let's talk about the Tomlin and Khan Pro Day stops. First of all, there were very few this year. And I know that that's a big topic of discussion around Steelers Twitter, because what do we know from the Steelers in the past? They like to draft players in the first round that Tomlin and or the GM meet with at the Pro Day. And so there were only 4 Pro Day stops for Tomlin and Khan this year. That was Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, and Michigan. And so that really narrows the playing field here in terms of potential first-round picks, if they are to stick true to this historical trend. And again, it's something that they've really done essentially every year since Mike Tomlin. You said there was one year, was it the DeCastro year?
Yeah, they did not go to Stanford because they don't go to Stanford. They don't go that far west. So they just clearly, they clearly were just like, well, we already know he's good, so let's just not worry about it. We'll just draft him. So yeah, I think that outside of that, I don't think since Tomlin's been here that they've taken somebody without meeting those requirements. So.
Yeah, and look, Steelers get really comfortable in their own scouting regions. They have their connections. They love like those Michigan schools and Ohio schools, and it's just what they do. Like they've drafted 2 players west of the Mississippi in the Mike Tomlin era in the first round, and one was just hardly west in what's his name? Drawing a blank here, Missouri. 2012, 2011, 2010. Who was drafted right before Hayward, the defensive tackle, is Ziggy Hood.
Oh, yes,
Ziggy Hood.
Right.
So
that's right. Jaggi was.
So yeah, they just don't venture out that way very often on the Pro Day trail, and so it's a historical trend. I'd be interested to see if it breaks, but so far they showed no interest in going that way again in the pre-draft scouting trail, and so I think that is worth noting. So if we're just to look at the Pro Day stops, Shayne, and knowing what we know about Tomlin and the GM, the evidence there since 2007, it really limits the playing field here on who these picks can be. You're looking at an Amarius Mims, a J.C. Latham, Terrion Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Nate Wiggins, really nobody from Michigan. I mean, McCarthy's the only like true lock first-round pick, and he's not going to be on Steelers' radar. He's going to be gone before that. So
I don't think so.
So if they stick to that this year, it's going to be really a really small pool to pick from.
Yeah, let's throw up. So you were talking about the graphic you have. So this is the graphic here, guys. So this is going to be the candidates at this point, essentially, for like what could be their first round pick. So if you look here, we have the pro days, 30 visits, and combine visits, right? So if they hit all of these marks, you're probably looking at a guy the Steelers are super interested in right now. That puts one guy in particular up here at the top. In their kind of first round candidate areas, Amarius Mims, right? We've talked about it. It kind of feels like that's who they're kind of singling out right now, or who they've shown at least the most interest in. And there's guys here too that they could easily kind of be in that conversation here soon. We'll see about the 30 visits because they haven't used many of them yet. So a lot of these guys that are in this consideration could still be there. These guys here too. But yeah, like I said, it's a small pool so far because you look at the pro days, not many guys hitting that pro day mark so far, and that's not a good sign if you want to be the first round pick.
Yeah, it's definitely not. And Mims is the guy that's checking every box. He's the only guy that has checked all 3 boxes so far when it comes to pro day visit, top 30 visit, and a combine meeting, a formal combine meeting as well. He also reportedly had the dinner meeting, and we're hearing less about this stuff. Like, I think they're being a little bit more discreet about it. Like, the Steelers are not disclosing all of their visits, and we're just gathering what we know and everything, just scouring Twitter to check this list. So for what it's worth, last year, Broderick Jones and Paris Johnson were the top 2 names. I did this chart for the first time last year. I broke down all of the visits. Broderick Jones and Paris Johnson were the top 2 names. The Steelers drafted Broderick Jones. 4th overall on the list was Joey Porter. They got him in the 2nd round, 32 overall. So, and then they drafted Keanu Benton and Darnell Washington, who I both had in this 2nd round category here, fairly high on that list. So it is a really good indication of who this team is interested in. Right now, I think that Mims is that safe bet guy. And if you're wondering like how you would weigh the value here, I think that the most important thing, the biggest thing that I typically look for each year, Shayne, is if you get the pro day meeting plus the dinner meeting with that pro day, like that. We've only heard of one so far, and correct me if I'm wrong. That's the only one that I know of right now.
That's what I've heard too.
In years past, we've learned of several of these. I mean, a good handful of the dinner meeting, pro day dinner meetings. That I think is the best evidence. It's like you are really on our radar for that first overall pick. I think the second in line would be the top 30 visit. So, and then the combine is the least relevant of the 3. And so if you're wondering why I have things sorted in a particular way, that is why. So let's just, we'll go through the top 30 visits so far. And I want to get your thoughts on these, Shayne. I've got all these pulled up right here too. Going from position by position, Michael Penix Jr., only quarterback with a top 30 visit.
Very interesting. Yeah.
They have Dylan Johnson, the running back from Washington. They have 4 receivers with a top 30 visit: Xavier Legette, Ricky Pearsall, Malachi Corley, and then just today, Taj Washington. Offensive tackles, top 30 visit: Talisi Fuaga, Amarius Mims, Matt Goncalves, and Travis Glover from Georgia State. Defensive lineman, top 30 visits: Darius Robinson, Braden Fisk, Mason Smith, Christian Boyd, and then just one corner, the local visit, MJ Devonshire from Pitt. So those are their visits so far. They've had the pre-draft visit the Steelers have had so far. Is there anything that stands out to you on that list, Shayne?
I think the receiving options that they've brought in are very interesting because I think they're all in that hopefully for them that 2nd tier of receivers, right? Like the 2nd round type of guys, where you hope that because of the depth of this class, a lot of these guys that maybe are talented enough to go earlier than their 2nd round pick might be there simply because of the depth of the class, right? You're looking at as far as 30 visit guys like Corley, Legette, especially Pearsall. Obviously, Roman Wilson is a guy that they haven't brought in for the 30 visit yet, but we've heard a lot about him because they're very excited about him at the Senior Bowl. Guys like that in that mold of okay, we hope that they can be in the 2nd round. We can grab them there. And especially Legette is the guy that I keep looking at because if you're looking at a skill set that Arthur Smith would like, I think he compares very favorably to A.J. Brown coming out of college in terms of their skill set. Big, fast receiver. Good after the catch, powerful, going to go up and attack the football in the air. That type of skill set is what Legette brings. And I think that is something that while Pickens can do some of that as well, I think it's not as natural of a role for him as it would be for Legette, especially in that run after catch threat. So that's the guy that I'm most intrigued by in that group as far as receivers go. And then obviously the tackles make a ton of sense, like the 30 visits for Fuaga. He just kind of, a lot of people view him as the best pure right tackle. I'm kind of, it's with him, I'm wondering if maybe he's a better guard, but a lot of people are in that, camp. So maybe I'm, not alone there. And then Mims, of course, is the guy that kind of stands out the most still so far.
Yeah, I think Fuaga for sure. They're just doing their due diligence at least. If he falls to that point, he has to at least be on your radar because he would just be that plug and play right tackle. You kick Broderick back over to the other side. I wish his arms were a little bit longer.
Right.
I can live with it. It's just 33 and an eighth is a little bit underwhelming for that, but he does have good feet in respect to his size. I liked his tape. I thought he had a good Senior Bowl. So definitely an intriguing prospect, one that is certainly on their radar now that he checks 2 of those 3 boxes. Not going to check the pro day boxes. Pro days are in the books already. So whatever we have for pro days, that's essentially it. There's a couple private workouts coming up here, and I think like a Yale pro day, and that's all that's left at this point.
Yeah.
So as far as the receivers go, it is interesting to note, Shane, that of the receivers the Steelers have visited with, Ricky Pearsall is the only one that checks the combine visit box and the top 30 visit box.
Yes.
So we might be looking into nothing here. And I think the 30 visit trumps everything else. So all these guys getting the 30 visit, they're all on a level playing field, but that is interesting to note. It certainly does seem like, though, the Steelers are eyeing that like early day 2 type of receiver. And then for the defensive line, Shane, I think that it is interesting outside of Braden Fisk, who does not have that length that the Steelers look for there. Rook Ohorahoro, Darius Robinson, and Mason Smith all are the tall, long, Stephon Tuitt type of defensive linemen, if you will, that fit that mold of the kind of old school player the Steelers are looking for there. So that's worth mentioning as well. Anything else that you wanted to get to on the pre-draft interest tracker?
I did want to mention Mike Sanders still as well. I think he is a guy that's very interesting to me because I don't know where the NFL is going to value him, because we've seen in the past guys who are true slot guys. And I do think he is a true slot guy. He tested very well at the combine and all that stuff. So I'm not saying he necessarily couldn't play outside a little bit, but he did it at Michigan as a slot corner. I think that's where his NFL position is going to be too. We've seen guys get drafted much later than they probably should in the past as a true slot corner. Does that mean he's going to be a 3rd round guy? I don't think that. I think he's probably closer to the Steelers pick in the 2nd round. If maybe the receivers aren't there that they want or something like that, could he be one of their top targets, for that slot corner position? Because I do think he could lock that down for a long time and make that position more of a strength than it's been since Mike Hilton left. So he's a guy too that I'm curious to see how early he goes and if he's there for the Steelers and if they have to make a decision on that.
Yeah, Mike Sainristil just feels like a Steelers player. Like he feels
really
like
does.
that Mike Hilton guy with ball skills, though, that you can just plug right in there and be the
more athleticism
slot corner.
Yeah.
So, and I like him a lot. I think he's a really good prospect. He is undersized, and I want him to play the slot because I think that's where he's going to be best in the NFL. If we do end up hearing that he does get a top 30 visit, Shane, then he checks all 3 of those boxes. And so I think that would put him high on the radar to be that 2nd round choice. I don't think he makes it to round 3. I think he's just too talented of a player coming off of too good of a season at Michigan, probably to fall to the 3rd round. Although it could come down to preference between these cornerbacks. And I think that it is also interesting to note, Shane, everybody, I mean, throughout the process, throughout the season has ended up until today, people have been talking about center for the Steelers. They don't seem to be as interested in center as everybody else does. Like they had a combine meeting with Graham Barton, and they sent I believe it was Pat Meyer out to see Jackson Powers Johnson. They did not send Tomlin and Khan, although that was early and free. I think it's 2nd day of free agency, so things were really busy then. That's what everybody's saying is the excuse there. Then the Big 12 pro day happens. They can go see Zach Frazier. They send their assistant offensive line coach to see him with no other schedule conflicts for Tomlin and Khan. And so it's just interesting to see that of this entire pre-draft visit tracker between pro days, top 30 visits, and combine visits, there is one guy who projects as a center to some teams and as a guard or a tackle to others. It is the only guy that fits that center bill that the Steelers that's potentially on their radar based on their visits that we know of.
It's very interesting because they clearly have a huge hole there, right? Like we can sit here and talk about like, oh, could they sign a free agent still, all this stuff, what's Connor Williams doing at this particular moment in time? Is he out there that maybe they're waiting to see what his deal is or whatever? But right now they don't have an actual center on the roster. Like you could say, can Herbig do it? We've talked about that. Maybe you could consider moving Daniels inside finally, but I don't really want to do that at this point because he's played so well at guard for the past few years. Like there's ways to talk yourself into being like, oh, well, they don't need a starting center in the draft. But if they don't go that route, there's going to be a lot of questions at that spot going into training camp. Like maybe they already have that thought out. Like I said, maybe they already have a plan in place if that doesn't happen or if they can't get one. But I don't love the choices they've made in terms of that particular position so far, like not finding a suitable starter, at least in the meantime, or committing to resources to find one in the draft. So.
Yeah, it's very interesting at the very least. And what I will say is when I say the center, I'm talking about the early round prospects. They did meet with Cedric Van Pran at Georgia's Pro Day. And they met with him at the combine. They also met with Bo Limmer and a few and Mike Nugent, a few of these like later round prospects, like mid to late round guys. So it feels like that's kind of the direction they're heading right now. And so I know that we're like, even this week today, we were seeing JPJ mock to the Steelers. We're seeing Graham Barton mock to the Steelers. I just feel like in terms of likelihood based on their visits and based on history, I don't think it's as likely as everyone thinks it is. So we're going to get into that in just a second. Anything else you want to talk about, Shayne?
No, I think we're good as far as that goes, in terms of like the tracker and everything that we've seen. Like there's just unfortunately not as much to talk about with it this year, like you said, right? Like there's just not as much happening. And you were talking about people having Jackson Powers Johnson still, stuff like that. We actually have a chat here. Powers Johnson will be the pick. He launched the same Steelers coach Jones didn't work out. So yeah, that I mean it's not that I would hate that. I do think Powers Johnson is a very, very good player. But again, the trends that we understand with this team lead us to believe that he is not on their radar early. Now, if he were to be in the second round and fall that far, which again, we've seen centers that are really highly touted. Creed Humphrey is one that we could have had as well. Like they fall to the second round a lot of the time. Like Linderbaum, I think, is the most recent example of a first round center. So, for the Ravens. So it's just not very common that you see these guys get taken high. Now, maybe that's going to change this year a little bit because there's several guys who profile as centers who might be really highly regarded, but you never know, right? Like we're not going to know this stuff for sure until we get into the draft and we see how teams value different guys and how they value positions. And all it takes is one team to say, you know what, Jackson Powers Johnson's the top 5 player on our board. We're going to take him here in the teens or 20s. Only one team has to do that. But if no one has him in that way, he could end up getting pushed down while other positions that are viewed as more important to them get moved up. And that's what we'll have to find out as we go along.
Yeah, there's just a couple factors here, Shayne. It's like the need for center. I don't know how big it is. If you already have a starter in place, you're probably not going to be interested in one of these guys, certainly not in the first round. Right. So, and then secondly, like we just don't have access to every single top 30 visit like we used to. But it does feel like somebody would have like if Jackson Powers Johnson had a meeting with the Steelers, I feel like that would be out there somewhere. Like somebody would have found out, and that would that's just my thought on that.
I like to think so.
And then thirdly, Shayne, it's so hard to go against these historic trends when it comes to the first round. Now, after the first round, anything's in play.
More dicey,
Pat Meyer was out there, so the Steelers could take him in the second round if he's there. But when it comes to being that first round pick, the 20th overall pick for the Steelers this year, I just can't go against that much historical data. And people say, well, it's a new regime with Omar Khan. Yes, it is. It's only Khan and Weidl's second year. However, Mike Tomlin's been here since 2007. He's had a huge hand in the draft process the entire time. I don't think he's going to give up that much control. He's going to want to see that guy. And so until I see that happen for the first time, really, it starts to become more than just like an exception, then I won't assume that they're going to go that route, especially knowing like a couple of years ago, Pouncey just retired. They could have drafted Creed Humphrey twice and they didn't do it. And that's when they had their O-line and assistant O-line coach out to see him. So I think there's just too much evidence to go against that. That's why I will not be predicting that Jackson Powers Johnson will be that guy unless maybe he gets that top 30 visit. I can change my mind.
Right. But again, like you also have to remember, like we're not telling you, and I'll never tell anybody to not like, if you're doing a, what would you do mock, right? Yeah. Tell them to take Jackson Powers Johnson. You can take whoever you want. They don't have to ever talk to him in their entire life. Like it doesn't matter. However, if you're trying to figure out like who it could possibly be, like if you're trying to actually determine, okay, what player could end up being on my favorite team, right? The Steelers are among the teams that are the easiest to kind of narrow that down to a certain degree based on their historical precedent. Could they change that? Like, of course. They could decide, you know what, Mike, I get it. You like seeing these guys in person. but it's 2024. We have a lot of information access. We can meet with these guys in person. We can do this stuff. We don't have to only take like these 7 guys in the first round. Like it doesn't have to be one of these guys. That's totally possible too. Now they need to do that before I'm going to start, like you said, assuming that's possible. But this year kind of is lining up to like, could this be the year that happens? Like if Mims is gone right now, if Wiggins goes, if maybe if the best player left on their board that hits everything that we talked about is Kool-Aid McKinstry, do they like him enough to take him at 20? Like that scenario could come up, right? But then maybe do you see them move down then, right? Do they react to that by saying, all right, well, we'll come down because the guys we love the most aren't there? There's so many moving parts to it that you just can't guarantee that you can predict what they're going to do at this point. So
yeah, exactly. And when you and I do this, Shayne, we're trying to follow the breadcrumbs here. We're not making, we're not saying this is not what would we do in this situation. Although you and I love to give our opinions. Like we're not afraid to do that at all.
You need to, if you're going to, there's no point in just
absolutely
putting out like what we think is going to happen, because anybody could try to determine what's going to happen. But
yeah, absolutely. And Shayne and I both watch film. We both study this stuff. We have opinions. We have things we'd like the Steelers to do. But for this particular chart tracker, this is just to follow the trail to see what could lead to the Steelers' first round pick. Our Barley chimes in with, there's no trends for Con though, really. They told us they weren't making QB changes. So I get the thing that that Con really doesn't have a lot of trends now, but to me, it goes back to Mike Tomlin is a powerful person in that organization.
Yes.
Nothing happens without his say so, really. I think that he's got more power and more longevity, obviously, than what Con does in a way. And so I think that they're going to want that mutual understanding there. I don't think that Con's just going to go over Tomlin's head in his second year as GM and pick somebody without Tomlin's say so. And so I think that it is important to note how things have been done in the Tomlin regime with the GM, not just the very brief sample that we have in the Con regime. And for what it's worth, I mean, the Steelers are 1-for-1 drafting a Tomlin/Con pro day visit player. So that again would exclude JPJ. Very small sample, but until that changes with Mike Tomlin still here and being just one of the most powerful voices in all of football, I think that I'm not going to believe that until it happens, Shayne.
Yeah, and again, like you said, I think the disinterest in center is a huge smokescreen to the point it's becoming obvious. That's totally possible. Or like maybe they, for once, are like, you know what? Let's maybe not make it very clear what we're going to do, right? Has it really affected them in the past? Not that much. I think that there's some examples, like they clearly wanted like William Jackson, if you remember, instead of Artie Burns, like stuff like that. Maybe that sometimes bit them in the butt. But in general, I think that, a lot of teams have a general idea of what teams want to do. Sometimes teams kind of go rogue. Like I imagine last year, the Lions probably surprised some teams with what they did. Granted, it worked out pretty well for them. They're not terrible second half away from playing for the Super Bowl. But again, like in general, like teams kind of know what the Steelers are about, and it usually doesn't really matter that much, right? Like they're not trying to like game them in any way. So we'll see if it changes. If it does, it'll definitely make things more interesting. I'll say that much. If we don't know, like I would love kind of to a certain degree, just from like not just a content standpoint, but also as a fan, like I'd be interested in kind of having a little bit less of an idea of what they're doing just because it makes it more fun. But they've made it pretty easy for us the past 15 years of kind of knowing what's going on. So
yeah, and 100% agree. If the Steelers throw us off this year and they take a JPJ or something when they didn't have that visit with them, all this stuff goes out the window. And you're right. We will be able to scrap these historic trends. But I'm just not buying. I really genuinely don't buy it.
It's hard
with Tomlin there and just knowing how much say he has in this organization, I'm not going to buy it until I see it. And that's just me personally. So let's move on to the next topic, Shayne, here. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you'd like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. And if you guys are joining us here in the live chat, go ahead and drop a question in for us. Let's talk Steelers draft. All right, Shayne, I want to answer some of the biggest Steelers draft questions that fans have put out there from the end of the season until this point right now, with a couple of weeks leading up to the draft. Let's break these down. And obviously we don't have an exact science for this. We don't have the exact answer, but we're going to give our predictions as to why some of these questions are being thrown out there and what the answers to them would be. So the first one, Shayne, is, will the Steelers take a center in round 1? This is kind of what we were already talking about. My answer is no, because Graham Barton was the only person that they met with who fits that profile. They met with him at the Combine, which is the least important of the 3 meetings between Combine, pro day and top 30 visit. They did not have any of the three with Jackson Powers Johnson. They did not have any of the three with Zach Frazier. They only sent assistant coaches out to see them. And so I think that is enough evidence right there to say, I think there's a very low chance the Steelers draft a center. And again, all this comes at us over the past couple of weeks. Before that, center was very much on the table. But I think now that things are starting to unfold the way that they are, unless we see that top 30 visit for really Jackson Powers Johnson or Graham Barton. To me, those are the two. I don't view Zach Frazier as a first-round pick. I think that would be a colossal mistake. In my point, I've watched a lot of Frazier. I don't.
Yeah,
I guess
know
I
you're
don't
not a
get
big
it
fan of him. Yeah,
with him, I feel like he's a lot closer to the Van Pran and some of those guys than he is to Barton and Powers Johnson, who to me are a significant tier ahead of what Frazier is. Anyway, doesn't mean that Steelers are immune to doing something that way. So we'll see if any of those three guys, I would say, get that top 30 visit. If they do, that puts them on the map. If they don't, I would say no. I don't think the center is, a round one center is on the radar for the Steelers.
Yeah, I would go as far as to say I don't know if it's on the radar for round 1 or 2 based on what we've seen so far. Because the guys who are likely to go in that range, like you could say Cedric could go in that range. I don't think he will. I think that especially because there's going to be 3 guys that likely go between day 1 and day 2. I don't think that there's going to be a 4th, and he would be that 4th most likely. I think you're looking at more likely a late day 2 pick, one of our picks on late day 2. Like that's probably the range that if you were going to guess when they were going to take an interior guy, specifically center right now, that's where it would be. So could it change? Obviously, yes. If something changes, if Powers Johnson ends up being a top 30 visit, if Barton ends up being a top 30 visit, now they're firmly in the radar, especially on day 2 if one of them were to fall there, which again, I don't expect with those two. I think they could easily fall like close to that. But I do think they are both prospects that are good enough, especially because of the versatility of them. It's not just a pure center. That's kind of the key difference, I think, when people have been trying to determine where they're going to go. Powers Johnson has the size to play guard. Like he has the athletic ability and the size to play guard for you if you don't want him to be a center. Same thing with Barton, where he's a tackle who's going to play inside, right? Like he could even probably play a tackle a little bit for you in a pinch. Like the versatility of those two is what's going to, I think, make their stock different than we've seen from like the Creed Humphreys and the John Michael Schmitz of the past. Like those types of guys are true centers, whereas these guys might have more in the tank than that. So to me, unless we see, like you said, the top 30 visits, they're probably not on the radar for pick 20 at least.
Yeah, I think that's what we need to look at. So if we see those come in, obviously our opinions can change. As of right now, I would say no. I think there's a low chance. Let's talk about the next question here. What position will be the target at pick 20? Now, just based on the evidence and following that trail of breadcrumbs again, Shayne, I think there's a very good chance that it's an offensive tackle. Either a Marius Mims, a J.C. Latham, a Talisi Fuaga. If he falls down there, I think those are the 3 that you are looking at. And I think the Steelers have a pretty good sense of who's going to be there. Like they typically know within a few players. And that's why last year I talked about the visit tracker that I had. Paris Johnson and Broderick Jones were the top 2 names on that list, the ones that checked every box. Johnson obviously went early. The Steelers traded up to make sure they got Broderick Jones. And then to me, there was a tier drop off to Anton Harrison as the next tackle. There's also Darnell Wright as well, who I think checked a few of the boxes for the Steelers last year, not as many as those top 2 tackles did. So I think that if you're looking at it this way, I think it's got to be offensive tackle, because even the cornerbacks, Shayne, like, yes, the Steelers were at Alabama's pro day. They were at Clemson's pro day. And so those are boxes that are being checked by Terrion Arnold and J.C. Latham, or excuse me, Terrion Arnold and Nate Wiggins and Kool-Aid McKinstry. But none of those guys, the Steelers have not used a top 30 visit on a first round corner. They've done it for a few other guys. But for the guys that are going to be first round corners, they have not used a top 30 visit to our knowledge. So I think that it's less likely that they do that. And I think that them being at those pro days was kind of more of just like, all right, they're going to be at Georgia and Alabama every year. And you could say maybe it was for Latham and Mims, because those are the guys that are checking more boxes right now. So that's my opinion on that. Do you have a different thought on which position will be the target at pick 20?
Not really. I think if I had to pick, I'll give like 3 in my order of confidence. I think tackle is very clearly 1 right now, just based on, again, historical precedent, who they're looking at, who's getting those check marks. That feels very likely, right? Corner would be 2. I think they've looked at multiple first-round corners between the pro days that they've been to, so that makes a ton of sense. I think that is kind of the second position that, let's say the tackle run happens before them and they don't move up to grab one, and the corners are just better players than the tackles are at that point. Maybe they say, all right, we wanted a tackle. Maybe we take someone later and see if they can compete with like Moore or whatever, right? We'll see about that. Then probably I don't want to say receiver because they haven't really targeted at least their ways of doing so, like top 30 visits, things like that with receivers yet that are going to be in that first round conversation. I would even say defensive line is a possibility. Like the Robinson visit is interesting, especially because he's kind of been billed as an edge in this class, which he played that last year at Missouri was his most productive season. I think him being an edge is probably the best thing for him, but he played defensive tackle his whole career until last year. He's probably going to play inside a lot on passing downs in the NFL. Could they view him as like that base 3-4 end type that they're looking for to kind of replace Hayward when he goes? Like that's an option too. Fisk, I think, is a day 2 prospect. The combine was awesome, but I still view him as like a late second type of player personally. So that would probably be my order for that position, at least for 20.
Yeah, and Robinson's so interesting. I think he's a perfect transition candidate to go from edge to interior defensive line.
Back to interior defensive line.
Has that big, strong, powerful frame. Was great
very
at
long,
the Senior Bowl. And so, but I do think he probably is a guy that realistically falls between Steelers' first and second round picks. So kind of in that awkward range right there. The next question, Shayne, where will the Steelers draft a wide receiver? So this one's interesting because right after Deontay Johnson was traded, I was very much under the impression that, yes, wide receiver can absolutely be on your radar with the 20th overall pick in the draft.
Right.
However, things transpired since then. The Steelers did not send their brass to LSU's pro day. They did not send their brass to Texas's pro day.
Right.
They didn't go to the Big 12 workout. And so some of these guys here that would be on their list, Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU and Adonai Mitchell from Texas, they only are checking the combine box at the moment with a little asterisk next to him that says, yes, the NFL owners meetings were going on, but there would be more. In my opinion, Shayne, there needs to be more for them to realistically be in consideration. I think those are probably the only two the Steelers would consider with the 20th overall pick. I love Ladd McConkey. I think that he's right in that Adonai Mitchell range for me personally, but I don't think the Steelers will like him as much. I think they're looking at a different type of receiver this year, more the bigger receiver in that Arthur Smith offense. But just checking the combine visit box is not enough for me to be that pick. I think that those guys need to get top 30 visits to warrant consideration.
At least.
So when you look at it this way, though, Shayne, the round 2 prospects, I mean, you used a top 30 visit on Ricky Pearsall. You used one on Malachi Corley, Xavier Legette. Ladd McConkey was a pro day visit. And so I think those guys, I think it's just looking at the sample that we have, I think round 2 is that going to be that sweet spot for the Steelers. And maybe they wait until the first of their third round picks. But I think that it's very possible there can be just a huge run on receivers by then. And then you're kind of left picking up the scraps with a Jermaine Burton or a Jalen McMillan or someone like that, who could be a tier gap separated between the guys that the Steelers really like that they've shown interest in.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think one of their first 2 day 2 picks, I would be shocked if it wasn't a receiver. Because again, like that's kind of who they're looking at the most, is guys who are going to fall in that range most likely. Now, again, it's really hard to tell with this receiver class how it's going to unfold, because we know probably who the top 3 guys are going to be off the board. Now, someone could surprise us and take a Brian Thomas Jr. ahead of like a Dunze or something like that, or whatever it is, right? But for the most part, we kind of know who those top 3 guys are. Past that, teams could value those guys as late first round picks. They could value them as top of the second round picks. It's just really hard to know like what the value is on these guys, because there's so many receivers. And this is kind of the funny thing about it when it comes to the drafts, is like having so many talented receivers doesn't mean that they're going to be 20 receivers in the first 64 picks, right? It doesn't mean they're going to be like, it means that likely a lot of guys who in other drafts would be top of the second round picks, middle of the second round picks, they might be late third round picks. Like that's just kind of the market of the draft in that situation. So there are probably going to be a couple guys, even at our first third round pick, that normally you take that guy in the second round, be happy to start him as a rookie, that are going to be there at that pick. So I expect it to be one of those first 2 picks on day 2, but if not, I'd be surprised if it's at least not one of the first one of their day 3 or day 2 picks that they have at least. So
yeah, receiver is such a good and deep group this year, Shane. I think it's one of the 2 or 3 best positional groups in this draft class pretty easily. But I do think if we look at history, even at like the 2022 class, for example, 10 receivers were taken ahead of George Pickens.
Yeah.
And that class wasn't nearly as good as this one is going to shape up to be, that I think, in terms of my grading. And so, and Steelers were picking in the middle of the second round then. Already 10 receivers were gone. And so a run on then can happen really fast. And so I think if I just were, again, saying this right now, weeks ahead of the NFL draft, I would say that the second round is where the Steelers are looking to target a wide receiver, because they're going to want that sweet spot where they can still get a guy that they really like, whether that be a Xavier Legette, a Malachi Corley, someone like that, and not have to fear about a big run on them going before they pick in the third round. So that's my prediction. And like you said, if it doesn't happen there in the second round, I would say that first third round pick, like I'm thinking that's at the latest that they'll target the receiver there. All right, Shayne, which cornerbacks are the Steelers targeting based on what we know? Do you want to go first on this?
Yeah, I mean, we look at the Alabama corners, right? They were at Alabama's pro day. We expect that Arnold probably will be gone by 20, at least in my opinion. I think that there is going to be kind of like a mini run on corners once we get past the first like 10 picks or so, maybe even earlier. The Falcons are a team that could definitely surprise and take a corner. Terrell going to be on a contract soon, like, in case that goes sour, stuff like that. But in general, I think there's going to be a corner run at some point before the Steelers pick. So if they really wanted one, they'd probably have to move up for one of the top guys. But Arnold, obviously, McKinstry is more in line with like where they're going to be picking in terms of availability. But I have him more of like a late first type of player. I don't think the upside's super high. I think he's a really good player right now. He'd probably come in and be able to be corner 2 for you. But I don't know if he's ever going to be, anything special or anything like that. So that's interesting. Wiggins is the one where I'm like, man, like he was 185 at the pro, like, so maybe I heard that he was sick for the combine and everything, and that's why his weight was lower and he plays closer to the 180s. I'm like, okay, I can live with that a little bit more. Like I was worried about an Emmanuel Forbes situation happening with him.
Yeah.
Although he's a better athlete than Forbes, I think he's more functional than Forbes was, but like that's certainly an option. I wouldn't be shocked if they love just the speed and the playmaking and how hard he plays. Like some of the chase downs he makes. So like the speed is real. Like you can see the speed on the field. Like so that's certainly something I can see happening if the tackles especially are gone by that point. As far as like the top guys, that's who I'd be looking at. I've mentioned his name a couple of times, and if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to double check this, but I believe he has like I don't know if it's considered a local visit or not, but Daquan Hardy from Penn State is a slot corner. Like him a lot. He's not getting a ton of love in the draft right now. Actually, I think he's not even like considered drafted by Mock Draftable, which I thought was very weird. He's had a great combine and everything, but he's a guy that I'd be interested in as like a slot. So there is some day 2, day 3 guys too that I think they're going to be interested in.
Yeah, I think, Shayne, if there is a run on tackles and the Steelers don't get the Mims, the Latham, the Fuaga, the guys that they're looking for,
right?
It really does look like, in terms of tackles, it looks like they're looking for that right tackle, so that you
can which I love personally. Like I'm glad.
I do too. I think that Broderick needs to be a left tackle. Ideally, I think that's best for his career path. And so they're not even. I mean, they have not really shown interest in the left tackle types, the Troy Fatanus, the Ola Fashanu. If any of those guys were to be available there, they just haven't really expressed interest. So I think they are looking at the right tackle type. If they get wiped out there, then that's when I can say, okay, if one of the 3 of Quinion Mitchell, Terrion Arnold, or Cooper DeJean falls to that pick, I think that there's a possibility right there. I guess you can't rule out Kool-Aid and Nate Wiggins, even though I don't love them in that spot, but they do check a few of those boxes in terms of pro day visit. So I think that is the only scenario really that they go first round. I mean, they could always throw us through a loop here, but it looks like tackle. And if they get wiped out, then corner. I think what they're really looking at, Shayne, is some of these best case scenarios on day 2, where the value lines up. If they can get a Mike Sanders still there from Michigan, I think that they would maybe pounce at that opportunity, depending on how they would weigh him compared to the receivers available. I think an Andrew Phillips from Kentucky, that's a guy that if you haven't watched his film yet, go watch him because he's got good size.
He has his fans. There's actually someone I watch that also does YouTube that has him as, I think, like a top 10 player in the class. Like there's some people that like really, really like Andrew Phillips, and I'm not there with him, but I think he's certainly a quality player. So.
And I think that he would be a great scheme fit because the Steelers could use an outside corner. They could use an inside corner. He offers a little bit of everything. And I feel like he would be a good fit in their defense. So I think that is what they're really looking at for corner. And if I were just to make a round prediction right now, I would say one of their third round picks, one of their 2 third round picks is a pretty safe bet where they're going to go with that cornerback there. And so I feel like that's the most likely. I just don't really see it happening in the first round unless they get wiped out there. So those are a few of the names out there that you want. You mentioned Daquan Hardy. That's another slot corner. It does look like they are specifically in terms of their visits looking at the slot cornerback type. And it makes sense because they don't have one of those on the roster.
Need to find that for sure. So,
all right, Shayne, when will the Steelers target a defensive lineman in the draft? I think this is an intriguing question. I know that lineman is kind of a sneaky need for the Steelers. It's not one that's been talked about nearly as much as center, tackle, cornerback in this draft, but I think it's right in that group, that second tier group in terms of needs for the Steelers. You've got an aging Cam Hayward. It's going to be 35 years old this offseason. Keanu Benton obviously is very promising, but outside of him, you really have nobody on this defensive line you can build around. I mean, we're talking about DeMarvin Leal is a potential like late round pick swap, just get rid of him type of player. Don't know for sure if he's going to make the roster or not. Loudermilk really hasn't turned into much of anything. And so outside of Benton and maybe another year or two left in the tank of Hayward, you've got nothing on the interior defensive line that you can count on. And so I think the Steelers want to get ahead of the curve before it's too late and they run into some really big troubles. They want to get some depth there. They want to get a developmental prospect who can be that long 5 technique, 4-eye, a guy that can move up and down their defensive line and give them some stability there and somebody that they can develop this year and maybe thrust into a starting role as early as 2025. So that's where it looks like right now. Shayne, are there guys that are on your radar for them?
So this is, like you said, one of the more interesting questions because like you could argue almost any round because they're looking at guys who could go in any round, right? Like Robinson is probably going to be, if not a first round pick, very close to being one. Whether you view him as an edge or a defensive lineman is up to you, but like he's probably going early. Fisk is probably going to go earlier than I'm willing to take him, but he's a very talented player, so he's going to go. Aroro could be very much like a second, third round pick. Like, and then you get even into like Mason Smith, who again, like the size profile and everything makes you think maybe he gets taken a little bit earlier than his talent suggests so far. But, you know, is he a third round pick, a fourth round pick? I'm really curious. And I've talked about this guy at multiple places, multiple shows at this point. I know that I believe he's going to be working out at Cooper DeJean's pro day that he's setting up for on the 8th, which I'm very interested to see the Steelers go to, by the way. Christian Boyd out of Northern Iowa.
Yeah.
He's a guy that I'm very curious about where teams have, because he's getting a ton of visits. Like people are showing a lot of interest in him. He's a huge player, like really well built. I think he could play pretty much anywhere along the defensive line. Tested pretty well as an athlete. I think he's going to test well as an athlete overall for his size. Like, if any round is potential for the Steelers with this position, because again, like there's a lot of guys that you're going to be able to take like in the 4th, 5th, 6th round that probably can contribute to you because this position isn't viewed as highly as some other ones. So they're probably going to end up going down the board a little bit. So.
Yeah, Christian Boyd's super interesting. 2 really good years back to back at Northern Iowa. I think he threw up like 38 reps or something.
Yeah, he certainly was a man amongst boys at that level. Like it was
small school competition, but those are the guys that intrigue me on day 3. The Alex Highsmith types that had the good production and graded out very well. And so that's a name to watch for sure. I think the Steelers would love to have a player like Rook. I just don't know if they're willing to take one in the 2nd round when they weigh it against like the receivers that are going to be there. That's the problem that I have, but I do think that that's a very much a possibility. Chris Jenkins is another player like firmly on their radar.
I wish they would have gone to Texas this pro day because Sweat in this defense would be hilarious.
I would love to see that. He's so big.
I know he's probably a guy that plays like 50% of the snaps max, but could you imagine? I know, and he was a good pass rusher for Texas. He really was.
Yeah.
Like if you have him on the field on 3rd down, you have Keanu Benton, you have him taking up 2 guys, you have TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith on the field. Like Hayward gets a breather every so often. Like that is a really, really difficult front to play against. Like day one, and I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think he's on the radar, but that's a guy too that like I just want to throw out there. If they were to bring him in for top 30 visit, big old thumbs up for me. Again, like they just don't make him like him. Simply don't make
I
it
like
okay.
T'Vondre Sweat.
Yeah.
T'Vondre Sweat to me is kind of like the Dawan Jones of last year. I was high on Dawan. You just don't get guys with that body type
Right.
that can
Right.
play as well as they can at that size. And so
Yeah.
I would be very intrigued by that true nose tackle type. It
For
doesn't look
sure.
like the Steelers have as much interest there. It looks like they're going with like the bigger, longer, like the
Yeah.
taller, longer
Yeah.
type of defensive lineman, the more versatile that can slide up and down the line. So
Right.
I think those are some names to watch, though. I think that you're looking again potentially as early as the second round, like realistically, and then as late as like the fourth round, maybe their fourth round pick. I don't see them really waiting any longer than that. I think it's going to
No,
happen.
I think they want to add a body there. It's pretty badly because you could tell by the amount of guys they're bringing in. So,
all right, Shayne, let's just get to one more question before we sign off here. And I want to do this each week just to see if it changes. We'll close with this question. Give me your early prediction for pick 20 for the Steelers.
I mean, we're gonna have this. It's Mims, right? Like that's the guy that you have to go with. The question is just about like, does he make it to 20? Because we've talked a lot about him already, but let's rehash a little bit. Didn't play a lot in college. Was behind a lot of really talented players. So there's some argument of like, not really his fault. It's Georgia. There's 5 stars on 5 stars on 5 stars. Like, okay, great. Well, the 5-star didn't play ahead of the 5-star. Great. Like, okay, whatever. But the injuries are definitely a bit of a concern. Didn't get to play a lot of snaps for that reason as well. But the snaps he played, he looked real good. And he's another guy that you don't see guys like that. You know, the 6'6 plus 340-pound guys who run well and move well and like long. Like there's just not a lot of guys that exist like that, right? Like there's an element of like when you have that type of body, like it's hard to get around those guys. Like even if the technique doesn't fully develop, if it doesn't get to the point where he's like this technician, there's gonna be some guys who simply just can't get around him because they don't have the length or the speed or the power. And that's really beneficial. You know, if 11 out of 18 weeks or 11 out of 17 games, the guy that's going up against him just simply isn't good enough to stop him or to get around him, that's really nice to have as a floor, right? Just kind of nice. Like you looked at Dawan Jones, you were talking about him earlier, like we kind of soured on him a little bit because there was injury stuff and like some questions about his like work ethic and everything. But when he played for Cleveland last year, he was kind of pretty good for a rookie simply because guys couldn't get around his frame. And like, he's obviously bigger than Mims and all that stuff, but there's an element of that that's really hard to ignore.
Yeah, I know a lot of people say like, all right, when you get up into 340-pound range, whatever, you're going to be injury prone all the time. You're not going to carry your weight as well. I mean, he looks like he's 300 pounds. He's so
you would
long
never think he was in the like even in the 320s, 330s. So it's just like you look at him like that. Yeah, that's not a 340.
That weight is distributed perfectly. Like if you could build a tackle from scratch, that's kind of what it looks like right there. The biggest question is the snap count, the usage. Like I can't remember where this stat came from, but he's going to be the first. He's going to be the first round pick to have this few of snaps ever since snap counts have been recorded in college football. And so that is a little bit concerning. At the same time, I think it means that maybe that the ceiling is pretty high for him because he's only scratching the surface of what he's going to do here. I know that there's a range of opinions on him. Some people don't like his kick slider, the way that he moves as much. You can't expect him to move like a guy that's like 6'4" and 317 pounds.
No, he's not Fatano out there. Let me put
the length and strength are so good to me that it's like, all right, it's kind of day one, like where you can't go through him. You've got to take a long route around him because he's got 36 and an eighth inch arms and 98 percentile wingspan or whatever ridiculous it is. I'm just intrigued by that frame. I think that there's so much to offer there. And like you said, Shayne, we don't know if he's going to be on the board. I think that all it takes is one team to say, hey, this guy is pretty enticing here. Let's pounce on him. And then maybe the Steelers in reverse of that are looking at a Fuaga or a JC Latham. So I do think that there's a good chance one of those 3 tackles is available because I think the run on tackles has to be quite deep. Like you got to be like 7 deep. To be down to like the Tyler Guyton range at that point. And I kind of think there'll be at least one of those guys remaining there, but Mims is a safe pick. Pro day visit, pro day dinner meeting, the combine meeting, top 30 visit. He checks every box that we look for to be that guy. I think that he's the safe pick. We'll see this time next week, Shayne, if that changes at all. And we'll keep tracking these visits as they come in. All right. Thank you for joining us today on the Still Curtain podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow the Still Curtain, download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast, Also, check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Steel Curtain Podcast. And thanks again for listening to the Steel Curtain Podcast.